All
Cool.
right, guys, welcome back to Dancing for Architecture, or whatever we decide to call this podcast.
Yes.
This is episode 2, and we are recording this before we released episode 1. And we have decided to add the link of the day to our podcast. So we will release some musical link and it will be in the show notes or the description or however you say that. And today's is an absolute banger. We're not going to tell you what it is. You have to click the link to find out. But
Yes.
I must say the piano arrangement is high quality. Uh,
Right. And then the vocals are very, very interesting, you know?
yeah, I'd say the synergy of the singers is very good overall. Like I say, they synergize very well.
Yeah, and the production's on point, the stereo, you got the right, the left, the vocals are just, spreading across the the mix.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there were some spicy chords in there too. Some pretty spicy chords.
I do agree with that statement.
All right, but today we have a greatly anticipated album. We have Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd,
Mm-hmm.
otherwise known as that one with the triangle and the rainbows.
Yes, the one you see on all the t-shirts, the one you see at Walmart, your friend's dad's son, that's the same thing, but that one. You've seen
Your
it.
friend's dad's son.
Yes. So basically your friend, unless your friend's a female.
Big brain plays. Yeah. So we could very easily call this one that white girl album that they've never actually listened to.
Yeah, yeah. It's that one out. You've seen it. You've seen it.
You've seen it, but yes, this album is genuinely one of my favorite albums of all time. It's probably top 5 for me at the moment. It's just so good.
Yeah, my background with Pink Floyd is actually zero. So this was very interesting. Like Ryan actually has been introducing me to prog rock and rock in general because, I didn't grow up too much with rock, but it's been a very interesting experience and I really enjoyed the album.
Yeah, for sure. I think so this album was released in 1973 and this was Pink Floyd's breakout album. Like they had released like 4 or 5 before this, starting in like 67, I think, was when they started recording and releasing music. But this album was the album that really put them in the spotlight and to mainstream appeal, as opposed to just being a niche psychedelic rock group that no one really listens to unless you're like a hippie or whatever. So this album is really what put them on the map. This is the album that a lot of people would consider their best. You have some hipsters saying that some of their later stuff is better, but this album is up there as one of their greatest and perhaps one of the greatest albums of all time. Maybe even the greatest, who knows? But I personally really like Pink Floyd due to their soundscape design, and this album presents that beautifully.
Yep, yep. And the themes on the album that we kind of see are them taking you through the different aspects of human life, the different stages of what we go through in the human experience, and we'll discuss that further. But it's a concept album to to its fullest extent. And Pink Floyd is known for doing their concept albums, as I've heard.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is probably the first of their concept albums, and I think this album just says a lot about society.
Yeah.
Yes, society jokes, but for real, no. Like I think Malachi put it well. I think the this really comments on the human condition as a whole, and probably my favorite thing about this album is just kind of anything that can drive a man to madness. It's just kind of being like I feel like the idea of madness is a central theme on this album, and overall sort of the human dilemmas that can lead you there.
Mm.
So it's a very, very well constructed concept album. It's a lot looser in its concept, where it's like a lot of things just more link back to the main idea as opposed to it being a story to follow.
Right. And it's also super listenable as well. It's not just like um it has its moments of like abstractness, but it's not just like those concept albums that are just beeps and boops for like 10 minutes. Um,
Yeah, it's very tastefully done. I think as far as Pink Floyd's albums go that are heavy concept, this is by far the most accessible of them. And in addition to that, I think that's the reason that this put them on the map so well, is anyone can appreciate this album on some level, similar to how we were talking about Jacob Collier's In My Room last podcast. If you haven't listened to that, go listen to that. What are you doing listening to the second episode before you listen to the first episode?
unless you just really like Pink Floyd, you know?
You know, there's something to be said for that. Like Pink Floyd is fire. So you're perfectly valid in doing that. But yes, this album is very accessible. And this is probably the first album that I listened to with Pink Floyd was, I believe it was The Wall was the first one I listened to all the way through. And then it was this one. But yeah, no, this album's great. I'd call it a 10, even though like I don't really like giving number ratings to albums. This one just is so well done.
Right.
So what was your favorite track on the album if you had to just pick one?
So if I was gonna go with one, like I want to say other ones, but I'm not even gonna lie. Money just always catches my eye. I've listened to this album before, and Money caught my attention last time. That was the only one I remembered when I first listened to it. I wasn't paying too much attention, but man, like I don't even want to get too much into it because I want to talk about it. But I'll say Money.
Yeah, no, Money is the obligatory thick grove of the album. I think that's going to be what we're going to do for every album. It doesn't matter if it's like Mozart or freaking Pentatonics or some like slam poetry album. We're always going to tag one track as the thick
Bro,
grove of the album.
Mozart has some thick grooves, bro. Beethoven
Yeah,
slaps.
Beethoven slaps, bro. Yeah, if I had to pick one, I'd actually pick the track right after that, Us and Them.
Mm,
Or like that one was one that I didn't really like a whole lot on like the first couple listen throughs. But as I continue to listen through the album more, the intricacies of it just really stick out to me. And we're going to get further into that when we go through our like track by track analysis. But I'd say Us and Them is probably my favorite track on this album. And that's subject to change because every time I listen to this album, another song grabs my ear. It's just so well constructed. There isn't a bad track on this album.
agreed. Yeah, I really just want to hop right into it. The first track.
All right, let's hop into it. Let's start with the slightly avant-garde Speak to Me, the title track, not why did I say title track? The opening track of the album. It is an intro more than anything else, and it starts with like people talking about if they are mad or not. And it's just like over these just like beautifully designed, not I wouldn't say beautiful. I mean there is a beauty in them, but I wouldn't say it's beautiful. It's more kind of jarring the way the synthesized sounds are just kind of playing around you, very, very both left and right ears kind of things going on. And it just builds so beautifully.
Right. And the use of ordinary sounds is something we see a lot in this album, but in this beginning we hear this heartbeat and if you don't know the background of the album, it's just like, okay, what is this? We're just listening to clocks and cashier machines and all this ambience, but later it just starts to make sense. So like Ryan said, it's really just an intro to the themes of the whole album.
Yes, for sure. And this one thing this album does beautifully throughout the whole thing is the way that it builds to certain things. And this intro track just builds to the album as a whole super well.
Right. And back to the heartbeat thing. We talked about how this album is covering the human condition. This is the start of a human life, the heartbeat. We're starting at the beginning of a human, just like we're starting at the beginning of this album. And yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't really think about it in that sense, but that is a for sure good way to think about it. But what's interesting is that that idea of the heartbeat is repeated through multiple tracks. Like it's not just the first track, but you can hear it. You can hear it later on time. You can hear
Right.
it, and on the last track, Eclipse, it ends with a heartbeat, and so that's really really cool. But yes, but this song builds into the first track of the album, Breathe, which is one of the it's just a beautiful moment when the sounds just kind of drop out, and where you had like clock ticking and cash register machines before, now you have this nice like sparse drum part with a bass part carrying the rhythm of the song with these kind of sparse guitar parts that are very ambient,
Mm-hmm.
that don't really add a whole lot of rhythmic structure to the song, but they add so much to just sort of the feeling of the
With the
song.
seamless transition, I might add. And we see those seamless transitions, man. Like sometimes I'll be listening and I'm like, oh wait, the song's over, and I hear like a slight pause, and then I check the song and it's just different. But these seamless transitions on this album are flawless. Like the transitions between the different musical ideas are amazing.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things about this album is it's meant to be taken as one work and not as how many tracks is it? Like the 10 tracks that it is. Like you're supposed to just listen through it all the way. And to take really any song by itself is doing the album a great disservice.
Right. And the vibe of Breathe, I loved the psychedelic, like it's very 70s, I'll tell you that. Like at least with
Very 70s,
the
yes.
guitar pedal is just super 70s, but I'm all for it.
Yeah, I am so for that. And one of my favorite things is about Pink Floyd is Roger Waters' bass playing. It's not groundbreaking by any means, but he just so effectively just kind of gets that throb that makes Pink Floyd sound like Pink Floyd. Like there's this little thing where like he'll drop from one bass note to another really quickly, and it's just like an eighth note thing, but he just does it so frequently that it's just like it's a very obvious stylistic choice where it'll be like doom doo doo doom or whatever, and like you can hear that kind of drop onto the next note, and it gives the song kind of a lurch, which makes it feel a little bit more disorienting, which adds to the effect.
Right. And about the actual narrative of Breathe, it's sort of discussing enjoying life while you're here. It's saying, while we're on Earth, this is all we got, so you might as well enjoy it. That's basically what the lyrics are covering. And it's funny, this rhythm, this, motif that's in Breathe, it comes back in two other tracks, I believe. I think it comes back in Any Color You Like. And so this theme of Breathe,
Does
I think so, yeah.
hold
But
up,
it changes the
hold,
key. It modulates down to E minor, I believe.
hold up, check that. Like I didn't notice that. That's funny. I've listened to this album dozens of times at this point. Like I've listened to this album so much, and I didn't catch that. I knew it came back in time, like lyrical with a little bit of a different lyrical context to fit that song, but I didn't know it came back and didn't notice that for Any Color You Like. That's
Yeah, it's
cool.
really cool. Just that motif, that groove, that drum groove, the sparse one that you were talking about. It comes
Mm-hmm.
back in the instrumental tracks in a way that's like, oh wow, this is a theme of taking in life in that way and appreciating it.
Yeah, for sure. I think the one thing that I noticed the most on this last listen through where I was taking notes and stuff for this podcast was just the absolutely brilliant synth and organ
Mm-hmm.
work on this album. And this first track really starts it out beautifully when he doesn't even come in until like the second verse, where he just comes in guns a blazing, and you just hear these organs just over top of everything, and it's just beautiful. And later in the album, the organ is more used in a sparse way that's just kind of adds to the soundscape.
Yeah.
But right here, he just comes out guns blazing, and I just love it. It's so freaking
Yeah, and
great.
I love the organ sound too. It's just like a wah, you know? Like I don't know how to describe it, but it's super fun to
Yeah,
listen to.
the sound engineering on this album is just great. Like this album still sounds super modern
Yeah, and I
to
don't
this
even
day.
think it was remastered. I think it was this is how it came out. 'Cause
It's mind-boggling. These guys were so ahead of the game in their production.
and I think that actually segues super well into On the Run just with their innovations and how they approach things. So, On the
Yes.
Run is an instrumental track, but it has like this crazy synth design, just sound design, all these different sounds on there. And I was doing research on what actually the sounds were, and apparently, I think I don't remember who, but someone dragged the mic stand across the fretboard to replicate the Doppler effect of like a car passing by. Yeah, so that's what
Interesting.
that like sound is. And then there's also like backwards guitars on there. There's just like and then not to mention the synth sounds of just like arpeggiating and it's crazy.
Yeah. To go back to that idea of the synth sounds arpeggiating, I think this track only works due to the fact that you had that synth arpeggiation underneath it, and you also had the 16th notes on the drums just going
Mhm.
like the track would be totally avant-garde and totally inaccessible without that there.
Yeah, it keeps the pulse.
Yeah, the fact that you had this just steady thing throughout the track that you could always just lock back onto. It's still a weird track, don't get
Yeah.
me wrong. It's still weird, and it's still not the kind of track that you're gonna get on most albums. But the fact that you have that just bass line underneath it ties everything together in such a beautiful fashion, and it makes it a very palatable and enjoyable listen for a track.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those tracks that you just sit down and take in. Like I'll be looking at something or just sitting there and be like, "Oh wow, this is a vibe." Same thing
Yeah,
with Any Color You Like. Just the instrumental tracks can just be on their own, which is really cool.
yeah, no, for sure. They stand really well. But let's move on to the
Yes.
next track after On the Run, Time. So this track opens with one of the most this track is the reason I don't listen to this album to fall
Oh
asleep.
my gosh, yes, the bells.
Because I'll be like drifting off or whatever, and you just hear all of these different clocks going off, and I'm just like, frick, what do I have to be doing right
Yeah, they
now?
just drop like I feel like they just I'm just imagining them just clashing a bunch of clocks together and like banging bells. It's just so eerie and like jarring and it's not super pleasurable to the ear, but I guess that's the point.
Yeah, I was sitting listening to the album. I think I had it like out of my headphones for some reason, and my roommate commented about like, "Yo, what the heck is that?" And I'm like, "It's Pink Floyd, bro. Like, don't at
Art.
me." It's modern art.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you have these clocks, and then it transitions into like I like how each of the clocks just drops out individually, and then you get the heartbeat again in that intro where it's more in the drums than being like a heartbeat sound like for the first track, but that thing that you can still feel there. You can still feel it there while you're getting these really sparse guitar and synth notes over top. And then this opening always felt like a western for me, like high noon, like two dudes be pulling up
Right.
and they're just like taking their six steps. I don't know. This feels like it could be a track in a Quentin
Right.
Tarantino
Some wild
movie.
wild west
And
type country cowboy.
Yeah, I like picture it where it's like the frame freezes when the drums drop in and you get into like the vocals and stuff and like the opening credits start playing. Like that's what I picture with this track.
Yeah, and oh my gosh, the guitar solos just in general on the album, but I'm not used to hearing guitar solos these days, and we've talked about, bringing guitar solos back, me and Ryan, but like,
Bring
yes,
back guitar
bring
solo,
back the
bro.
guitar solo. It's who's the guitarist in this band? I'm not sure.
David
Okay,
Gilmour.
and I remember he did vocals too, but David Gilmour, man, like his solos on this whole album are just super unorthodox, but like so creative, you know?
Yeah, I think the solo on this track is one of my favorites of all time. This album just has so many guitar solos that I'm just like when I think of like great guitar solos, I think back to them. And the one on this track is really good because the solo is not exactly front and center. It's almost as a part of everything going on. It just kind of melds into everything else that's going on. But it's still super there and you can super hear it, but it's just like more a part of the scene than anything else, which I think also adds to the
Yeah,
brilliance.
and the narrative of this track, so the name is time, and so the narrative of it
Mm.
is the progression of time, things start, things end, our lives begin and they end. And there's a lyric at the very end. It says, "The tolling of the iron bell calls the faithful to their knees to hear the softly spoken magic spells." So it's basically talking about a funeral and how people at the end of their life come to God or come to, magic spells. And I think one of the bandmates is an atheist or something like that. So he was having a commentary on that. But just the whole progression of time, as we can see with these clocks and the ticks and, how things go, that's the narrative of this track.
Yeah, that's interesting. I took the end track to transition into Great Gig in the Sky to be very different, where it's like this idea of like there's just this idea of everyone rushing to like either like when you're young you waste your time and when you're older you wish you didn't, and everyone's scrambling to do like the best that they can with their time, and then there's this just narrative of people who have a faith just looking to the sky knowing that there's something waiting, and then that transitions beautifully into Great Gig of the Sky or In the Sky, where it just opens with this dude talking about that he isn't frightened of dying and why should he
Right.
be, but then like it's a beautiful transition from that track into what I can only describe as a soundscape designed to feel like a glimpse at heaven or an afterlife.
Right.
And oh boy, Great Gig in the Sky. My goodness, is
Yeah,
this track good?
I really like this track.
This is probably my second place track for if I had to pick a favorite track that wasn't Us and Them. It's definitely this one. Like this, it goes back and forth between these two, but it just builds so beautifully up to this just absolute explosion of sound because you have like the piano at the beginning that's just like slowly building up, and then you just get doom doom doom, and then everything just comes in with just the beautiful vocals of I don't know who
I
sang
believe it
this.
was Core Tori or something. I looked it up, but it's this lady and she's just going crazy like on this track. It was amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it's absolutely nuts because like I think what's so beautiful about her vocal performance is just how much it matches the instrumentation. I don't know if they had her record the vocals first and then they recorded the track, or they recorded the track first and then she recorded the vocals over top of it. Either way, the energy is so beautifully matched between the two at every given point, where you have at the beginning you have this just absolute explosion of sound where you can just see the pearly gates just right in front of you, and you just have that picture and everything's super clear, But then after it drops off, it's more of like a fading memory of seeing that or whatever when the energy is a little bit lower. And that's just kind of the picture that I get from this track. And it's just insane.
Yeah, and the piano on its own could be its song, but once it just gets into that do 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 do, and then the triumphant like oh my gosh, it's just
It
so good. It's so good.
kills me. Yes. And I believe that this is where you go from side one
Yeah,
to
this is the
side
end of the
two
first side.
from
Yeah,
the album. And I think that's another interesting thing that's kind of been lost in the era of CDs and Spotify and stuff is that you don't get this idea of two different sides of an album. And it's really cool listening to older albums and just being able to pick, okay, this is exactly where they split the sides and it's used very effectively. This album is a great example where it's like they only had one single off of this album, and that's Money, which is the next
yeah,
track. And they put the perfect spot to put it at the beginning of the second
yeah. And I think with the
side.
sides too, the lost art of sides is is a big one because it's like having a first act and a second act, and it's more like a play or like a big production in that way, and that's kind of been lost over the years. So it's really creative how they use the sides to their advantage here.
Yeah. The one example that I think about this that's used most effectively is another Pink Floyd album, and it's The Wall, which is actually a double LP, so it's two records, but you can hear you have the transition between the first record and the second record, where if you just listen to it straight through and you don't really think about it, there's a narrative thing, there's a narrative turnaround where you're like, wow, that was fast. But if you have like the actual like flipping of the album or like the switching of the records, you get that sense of like time passage, which is really cool. And while it's not nearly as narratively impactful on this album, I still think that they did a great job of letting Great Gig in the Sky just kind of sit to rest. And then you have Money, which is a far more
Right.
cynical track coming after it. But yes, let's
Yes.
get on to Money. This is the certified
Banger.
thick groove of this album. It's an absolute banger, bro.
Yeah, Money, it's just like immediately you get this. It starts out super smooth, like it has the saxophone, it has the jazzy feel, and then we just have like this 7/4 time, and it's really it confuses you at first. It's like, okay, dun 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 dun, dun, and then you have the bluesy bass line, dun 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 dun
Yeah.
dun, 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 like it's just it it really is like a tribute to blues in a lot of ways, which is interesting because of the narrative on money, and blues songs talk about the struggle of money a lot. And it's, I think it's really fitting, just the blues vibe of it and the structure of the chords as well and the bass line.
Yes. And can we talk about the brilliance of the
Oh,
cash
yes.
register sounds at the very beginning? You just get all of these different cash register sounds, making it feel very industrial and very materialistic. And then you get this very cynical bluesy bass line. And the bass sound through the rest of the album up to this point is very full and very round, and it's very much where it's not as much hit by hit. But then on this track, you get the bass line coming in with just like the most punchy in your face bass
Right.
tone that you can get. And you just have this bass sound that just contrasts so heavily with the rest of the album. And boy, is that a
Yeah.
good bass line. There's very few bass lines that I'd rather sing
Right.
along to
Right.
the bass line more than like them. But this one, whenever I'm listening to this album, I'm just singing along to the bass line, and I don't care that it's the same two measures over and over again or whatever. I don't care.
Right.
It
It's,
slaps.
yeah, I definitely agree with, there's those few songs where you just sing the bass line, and this is definitely one of them. And when you think of this song, you just think, okay, you think of the big switch to 4/4, which we'll talk about, but you mainly think of that dum 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 like, and then the just it's so groovy, bro.
And you mentioned the drop to 4/4. That is the moment when I
Oh
just
my
die
God,
every
yes.
time. I die inside. And my life is complete with the adding of that drop to 4/4, where you just get this. You're coming off of this just really good, very cynical saxophone solo, heavily electronically edited saxophone sound, but it's just like you listen to that saxophone and then you go into it just drops into this really huge 4/4 section with the guitar solo. Again, going back to these really good guitar solos, and that transition into 4 makes you feel a greater sense of urgency with it, but it just kills me every time. I'm just like, this
Right,
is so
and the
good.
guitar solos, like there's like three different vibes. There's like the wet one with the heavy reverb at the beginning, and then there's the dry one where it feels like they're just in a room jamming. And then there's that last one where it's just like super wild. And what you talked about with the saxophone is it's super unorthodox. It's like going I'm like, bro, what? It's it's super electronically edited, but it's super interesting to listen to as opposed to just like, a normal jazz sax solo, which is cool, but it adds the flavor.
Yeah, and again, this track all comes back to the bass holding it together. This track wouldn't be nearly as iconic as it is without the incredible bass line that it has and the sound that they chose to put on the bass. Wouldn't be nearly as
Yeah.
cool
And you
without
talked
that.
about like the cynicism of the song. It's really weird, the narrative of the actual song, because it's like two narratives at once. So he's talking about how money, get away and how it's evil at times, but then he's also bragging about the stuff he can get with money. And then it's just like a back and forth. It's really weird. And it's kind of sarcastic in the way it's approached.
Yeah, it's it makes a lot of sense if you go and listen to the album Animals after this. Animals is a take on George Orwell's 1984, but it's talking about capitalism instead of communism. And he talks about this idea of money being or wealth being a stone that will drown you if you're just like letting it run your life. And I think that's a really interesting take that he has there where he just sees he just sees money as this sort of kind of like dual natured thing, as you said, where it's like you can brag about how much of it you have and what you can buy with it, but like people, like the last line that he says, I think just beautifully illustrates this idea. They say it's the root of all evil today, but if you ask for a raise, no surprises, they're giving
Right.
none away. It just beautifully puts into perspective this track, and I like at the end I love the people talking. The question that he asked them that they were giving an answer to is the last time you punched someone, did they deserve
What?
it?
I didn't even peep that.
Yeah, no, you didn't hear it on the album, but like if you go and like look it up, there's like you can find like the list of questions that they asked the people. And that was the question that he asked there is the last time that you punched someone, did they deserve it? And you get this just collection of absolutely hilarious answers. Like you get you get someone was like, I certainly was in the right, and someone who's like, he was cruising for a bruising. I don't know, I was
Oh my
quite drunk at the time, and just like all of these different answers, and it's just, it's a fascinating thing. I love the way that they just use these interviews with people and just put them on the album in just such different, such, and it just adds so much flavor
And then the
to the album.
seamless transition into Us and Them.
My favorite track on the
Okay,
album.
so
Let's
Us
go,
and Them,
boys.
it's immediately like this low tempo, chill vibe. We got the sax back. But then, we got this D into E sus, and then we have a D minor major 7. And it creates so much weird tension and it's eerie, but it fits so oddly. It's like it's super weird, the progression, but you get used to it, and it also represents the narrative pretty well.
Yeah, no, for sure. The thing I love most about the transition from Money to Us and Them is you have the heavily electronic, heavily cynical saxophone of Money, And then you have on Us and Them just a very honest, pure saxophone. And it just kind of takes the two tones of the songs, and you just have one instrument that you can compare from the two to just get a difference in the feel. And I think that's really cool.
Yes, and the narrative of Us and Them is also very interesting. It's like this came out in 73 and the Vietnam War wasn't over yet. It ended in 75. So this is like near the tail end of, the whole Vietnam War culture back in America. And the mindset of Us and Them, the black and white, cats and dogs, or like this or that mindset is kind of what they cover in this, but it leaves no room for the in between of, we're all figuring this out. They over there, the people we're at war with are also people and they have lives and, they're figuring it out too. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting narratively. And I think with the sound construction of this song, I think on the last podcast I talked about the concept of open music versus closed music, where it's like you have things that it's just like very tight and rhythmically like strict, and you don't have like a lot of sounds that just kind of bleed, I suppose, into like everything else. Like everything is very closed. But Us and Them somehow is like, okay, for the verses it's like somewhat closed. It's like still got like that sort of very characteristic Pink Floyd openness. But then when you get to the chorus, it just opens up into just this very wild, not wild, but you have this very spacious, very loud, very open sounding chorus where you just have the drums are very, like, if you're not listening super closely, you can't really hear what the drums are doing. And the drums are doing just the bare minimum to keep everything together. And everything else is almost sort of this rubato feeling where you don't
Yeah,
really have a sense of time for the.
I don't know
It's just
why,
really
but
cool.
the triumphant nature of the song kind of reminded me of, a battlefield or like some some sort of just big event or celebration or like conflict. I don't know why, but it was super fitting for the narrative.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the saxophone solo and the piano solo. The piano solo. Let's just talk about the piano solo. So on this album, the only other use of just like pure piano that I can remember is on Great Gig in the Sky. But then on this track, you just have this just beautiful piano solo that just is so fitting of like just the earnest nature of this song, where you don't get a lot of like just piano solos. Like you get a lot of synth solos in rock, but in this era of rock, you don't get very many just like pure piano solos, and it's just so beautiful here. And that is one of my favorite things on this album. Is
Yeah.
just that piano solo. Probably learn it at some point just to play it
Yeah, you
because
get
it's
very
just great.
lost in a lot of tracks on here. But another seamless transition from Us and Them into Any Color You Like, an instrumental track.
Yeah, it's really funny. This is actually probably like this is the track I always forget exists. It's I don't know, it's weird. Like I just have a hard time remembering. Like I was talking to one of my friends about this album and he's like, there aren't really any deep cuts on this album, and I'm like, you're right. And then I was thinking about it and I was like, oh shoot, I completely forgot that Any Color You Like is a
Yeah,
track that
it's like
exists.
I usually forget how it goes too. Um, all I know is that it references that breathe groove, but I right now I don't remember how it goes. I just remember it was a vibe. Um, really,
Yeah.
cool.
I think the main thing that this track does that it's really needs to do is it brings in a specific style of synth sound for you to just kind of get used to it, because the synth comes back on Brain Damage, the next track, and it transitions it transitions from Us and Them into Brain Damage very beautifully. And it's just, other than that, it's just like a jam. Like it's just like they're just vibing on their instruments. I think this is a
Yeah,
track that they're
and
just having
they
fun with.
had some sort of narrative, obviously, with relating Any Color You Like, and then there's the art of the album, and there's also I was looking into some narrative, but to be honest, it's like this is just a vibe, you know? It's just a
This is
sick
just a
groove.
groove. Yes, but let's talk about brain damage. I feel like this song is the accumulation of the album, where at the beginning I was talking about how it's about the human condition and all the things that could drive a man to
Oh yeah.
madness. This is the madness of the album. And I remember the first time I heard this song, and I was probably like 8 or 9 the first time I heard this song. So that's a while ago. Dang, that's like 10 years ago. Uh, Gosh, I feel old. Uh, but this track is really interesting. This track has always struck me as really interesting in just kind of this. It's just basically like a blues structure to a song. It's like not blues, but it's like got that structure of repeated line, variant, back to the first line kind of thing, and then you get into the chorus. But yeah, no, this track is super interesting. I think the narrative of like a lunatic slowly getting closer, and then when the lunatic is in my head, like I don't know, like I just find it interesting where it's like, okay, you can feel madness approaching, but there's not
Right.
really anything you can do to stop it.
And there's like
I
this
thought
imagery
interesting.
of this lunatic on the grass, and he keeps saying it. And I'm like, okay, somebody's crazy right now, and just dancing on grass, and just the declining of the mental state. That's the first thing I kind of think of, especially when we're talking about the human condition and how this narrative of okay, we're kind of going down in our brains, and it made me research. I was like, okay, why would they talk about this? And apparently their former member and one of the founding members of the band, his name was Sid Barrett. Yeah, and he had a
Yeah, Sid
crazy
Barrett.
story of mental health. Apparently, he started showing like odd signs in the late 60s. Like he just started having blank stares. He would go to the shows and just play one chord. He would at their concerts, he would slowly just detune his guitar for no reason. He would have trouble holding his pick. He wouldn't even bring his guitar some days. And even I was looking at this one time, their very last practice session with him. He Sid Barrett, he brought this proposed song called Have You Got It Yet? And basically he had all the band members practice it like, it was a song idea, and they just weren't getting it because every time they would play, he would change the arrangement just for the lulz. Like, and basically that's the name of the song, Have You Got It Yet? And they were so mad. Like,
Yeah, Sid Barrett was interesting because a lot of fans of more psychedelic music, they think that Sid Barrett stuff is like the best stuff out there for psychedelic, and he just had such a sad musical career where it was just like he he released Piper at the Gates of Dawn with Pink Floyd, which was just a brilliant record for psychedelic. Like I'm not the biggest fan of psychedelic music myself, but that album is hailed as one of the most brilliant works of psychedelic rock as a whole. And then he just kind of and then he released 2 solo albums, then he just went crazy, and then he just had to live a private life. He couldn't handle the pressures of being
right.
in the spotlight. And it's really sad because like his work was
Yeah, he
genius.
helped to start this whole thing, and then he just declined. And I was looking into, when they were writing, they had him in mind because this was fresh for them because they made this album in the early 70s, and late 60s is when the whole Sid Barrett situation happened. So it was super fresh in their minds. So they definitely had him in mind when talking about the slow decline. In fact, in one of the lyrics, they talked about if you're in a band and they're playing the wrong song, I'll see you on the dark side of the moon. So they specifically were talking about him in that lyric. And, we see the mention of the album title. So that was cool.
That's interesting. It's that's one of my favorite things to point out is when you just like points and laugh.
Yeah.
Hey, there's the album title. Hey, they didn't just name it
Yes,
this
I was like,
arbitrarily.
wow, that's the title of the album.
Yes, and I think this is a great spot
Oh
to
yes.
transition to the last track, Eclipse, which Eclipse is one of the tracks that I kind of had an epiphany about a while back that you're not supposed to take it as a track per se. And this is just kind of my interpretation. It's just the album closer. So, you know how at the end of songs, a lot of times they'll just like, with just like songs in general, they'll just like tag a line over and over again to close out the album. This is just like one melodic idea just for 2.5 minutes. But the thing that makes it work is the build and the fact that you're taking it in at the
Yep.
end of the album. And it is a perfect way to close out the album with just kind of listing off
Right.
just
Everything you
human
touch and all that.
things. Yes, like I think the line that always sticks with me is all that you buy, borrow, or steal. I don't know. Like that line is just brilliant to me. Like I don't know. Something about that
Right.
just
Because
that
all
one
the
line. I
stuff
don't
is
know. I
just
like
gonna
that
go
line.
away with life. And that's kind of what they're covering through this repeated line of, all the things you do this, all the things this, all the things in life will come to an end. And that's this whole eclipse, the sun and the moon crossing over in that way. And then um the very last lyric where it talks about there is no dark side of the moon, but like everything is just dark. That was like, wow.
Yeah, it's a really depressing end to the album, and it just ends with this kind of heartbeat, just like the beginning, and you
Right.
can just loop the album over and over again,
And
and it's
I
a
had it
perfect
on loop
loop.
on Spotify,
And
and
I
then
think,
the heartbeat started again. I was like, wait, am I in the end or the beginning?
yeah, it's just brilliant. Again, this album is so good, and also if you haven't done it, uh, if you've listened to this album, go look up Blart
What?
Side of the Mall on YouTube. So this dude, I won't spoil too much, but this dude is there's this podcast
Oh
called
gosh.
Till Death Do Us Blart where these I think it's like these four guys just watch Paul Blart Mall Cop every year and they talk about their experience with watching it the latest time. And this dude watched Dark this dude watched Paul Blart Mall Cop synced up with Dark Side of the Moon. And the amount of just absolute perfectly lined up things between the two
I need to
is just
check that out. I've
hilarious.
never heard of this.
Yeah, no, Blurred Side of the Mall is one of my favorite videos that I've ever seen on YouTube. It just kind of stuck with me. I'm just like, that's really funny. And then I think that kind of started a meme of people syncing things up with Dark Side of the Moon. Like one dude synced up steamed hams, that one meme with Dark Side of the Moon. And it's just like looped over and over again, and people just like talking about like different sync stuff in the comments. It's really funny. But yes, this album as a
Yeah.
whole, really great. I'd say it did what it set out to do really well. It creates a beautiful soundscape. I get lost in the world. It helps you to understand Roger Waters' point of view on a lot of things. And I think what's really cool is just getting to look at the album through my own worldview of like things don't have to be meaningless. And that's why Great Gig in the Sky really sticks out to me, that transition into that track where it's just like, hey,
Right.
you can have this greater sense of hope
And
and
even
life
though
isn't
it
all
has
meaningless,
this
you know?
depressing overtone, it also has a really hopeful theme as well, especially with things like Great Gig in the Sky and even the hope of having that first heartbeat and, the cycle of life. It's not all bad because this theme of enjoy it while you're here it's true. It doesn't have to be this dragging on of existence until death. And they talk about that as well. But amazing vocals. This is a great, introduction, at least for me, into this category. It's this is I don't know how other things in prog rock are, but like top notch, bro.
Yeah, the interesting thing about prog rock is it's more of a philosophy about writing rock music as opposed to being a genre. Because this album sounds completely different than something by Rush or something by Jethro Tull or something by Yes. It all sounds completely different. And that's why I think prog rock is so brilliant, that it's just like taking a more intellectual approach to writing rock. But yes, I really enjoyed this album. I'd give it, I'd say that it definitely achieved what it set out to do. And again, go watch the link of the day. Um, Beautiful, beautiful content. And we will catch you in the next episode whenever we release that.
Yo, real quick, check out the new Instagram D4A podcast. It's in the description. Peace.